Hello, everyone, and welcome to a special edition of the Legal Hour. Um, I am normally coming to you on the last Sunday of the month. I did not do that for June of 2026 because as I started to think about 250 years of the Declaration of Independence, I thought to myself, okay, for the 200, I wasn't around yet. I wasn't born. And if I am still living at 300, um, I may not be clothed in my right mind. I don't know if I'm always clothed in my right mind now at this point at 250. So I thought that it'd be, even just for me, a great thing to be able to kind of record my thoughts in regards to this anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And to be able to share it with you all and looking at it from a legal perspective. Because that's something for me that I think is really important when I look at this day, um, the 4th of July, as I'm recording this and uploading this on my platforms, is to, really think about what does that mean to me and what does that mean to others. And I'll be honest with you, for a large part of my existence, um, I didn't think about it as far as the institutions. I, was probably able to repeat more to you of Frederick Douglass's "What does the Fourth of July mean to somebody who has been enslaved?" Or different things of that nature before I would necessarily think of a celebration of the Fourth of July. Obviously, in the last couple of years, we've celebrated Juneteenth as a declaration of freedom. Um, and there's still a lot of issues I have in regards to how and why we celebrate Juneteenth, and a lot of people not knowing the true history of it. But for me, the changing moment in considering the 4th of July and a celebration of the 4th of July and a recognition of the 4th of July came um, back during COVID times when I decided that I was going to hit two different places that I had never been. And I went to the first place being Philadelphia on my birthday. As you can see, everybody has masks on still during this time. So I went to see Philadelphia, and I went for my birthday as a solo trip because I knew that I wanted to go to a bunch of different places. So, I went to Constitution Hall and all of the other associated museums, the Constitution Museum. I went to the prison that's considered one of the first prisons in the United States, and I was there for like half the day. I looked at every exhibit. I wanted to see these different places by myself, and I knew other people would not be as interested in going to Philadelphia and spending all day, at the Liberty Bell and, all the other places. And then I went to Boston that same year, about a month or two later. So this is the picture of me throwing my East Indian tea off of the boat after we did the interesting. It's a fun recreation of the Boston Tea Party, and they gather you together in their costumes, outfits, and they kind of do the period acting, and then you go out and you get to throw the tea overboard. Um, and so that was a meaningful experience for me in a lot of ways, doing those two trips, going to Philadelphia and going to Boston, because it did something to me. I woke up really early that morning and was like one of the first people in line, one of the first tours to go into Constitution Hall. I do have some pictures of that. I'll share them again later on in my recording. But this was, the room where it happened, right? I'm sorry, you're going to get Hamilton references and probably more than once during this recording. But to stand here in this place and to see the spot where our government came together, how small it is. I didn't include a picture on this, but the first Library of Congress is literally like a room that is the size of, you know, the the main room in my office now. And to see the Senate room, I do have a picture of that I included. this regal room upstairs that was supposed to be for the Senate to meet, but these rooms are so small and people would have been real close together. And, the heat that we've experienced the last couple of days, they were close. They were talking. Um, it was not lost to me as a black person, as a black woman. You kind of stand past and they have a barrier there to this spot. You can't really go into this area that's pictured and walk around or sit in the chairs or different things. It's not lost on me that would have been the closest that I would have gotten to that action at that time. And that's an important thing that will always characterize my discussion of this, because it needs to. Um, my focus, my master's degree is in world history. My focus is Africa and the African diaspora, and particularly legal and educational systems of Africa and the African diaspora. And so I have to, in this moment, and especially once I stood in that room, have an understanding that, standing in the back of that room would have been where I stood on July 4th of 1776. Um, and so I do think that's important for us to conceptualize and have an understanding of what these men did, which was a really amazing thing. It really was amazing. And to stand in the room and then to go to the museum that's close by this Constitution Hall. You go to the museum and you can stand next to the founders. So, you can stand next to the short ones and the tall ones. And you can see where they're from and learn more about them. And you can, figure out, you can just see it in real life. You can really feel the weight of the decisions that these men were making, and that it really was an experiment. 250 years is not a long time. I just came back from Italy a couple of years ago. I went to Greece. When you go through and you do history tours there and you're walking through different places with established governments of hundreds and thousands of years in some cases, you really think about the fact that 250 years is not a long time. And, when we talk about the surviving of not only the Declaration, but then the legal systems that came from it. And any of my students watching this is like, oh my gosh, she's going to talk about the Articles of Confederation again. I am, but it's okay, because we have to know about the Articles of Confederation. But, when you think about it, 250 years is not a long time. So, I approach it now, having been in those spaces and seen those spaces, had those experiences a little differently than I even did growing up, even going through my master's program, even going through law school. I think that an acknowledgement of the document and the beginning of the process and the beginning of the systems that have led us here today at 250 years is really important. So I'm going to give you all a little bit from, I teach a series of courses at the university where I teach, that's starting back over again. So I'll be teaching judiciary. Then I also teach a course on the presidency. I teach a course on Congress. I teach a course on political parties and elections. And those are all in this series of different courses in political science realm. So I pulled a couple of my slides from my course on Congress, because I think it's important to know that this wasn't just a group of men that just randomly showed up in Philadelphia and ended up signing this document. The group that ended up signing was part of the Second Continental Congress. So there had been a First Continental Congress, and there had been several other Congresses that had been formed before that time with the colonies. And they had some people participating and some people who didn't. There was different conferences that they had with Native American populations. There had been this idea of a federalization or a grouping of the different colonies for a long time. And so we get to the Second Continental Congress in preparations for what they knew they wanted to do, which was separate from the crown, separate from the British Empire. So the Second Continental Congress is from May 10th of 1775, so almost a year before we end up with our Declaration of Independence. And then they went until March 1st of 1781. So this is the longest of these different Congresses that were coming into play before we would have the Articles of Confederation and then the formalized United States government, the formal federal government. It mainly happened in Philadelphia, but it also happened in other places, Baltimore, Lancaster, and York. And at this point, this was really the first of these Congresses where everybody joined in. Georgia was a holdout. And having lived in Georgia for 12 years, when I first really started to look at this, I was just like, okay, I can understand when I start seeing and reading some of Georgia history. My friends who are from Georgia would talk about the way that this was kind of played to them when they had to take Georgia history back in the day. And it's very interesting to see how it's taught in Georgia as far as why it took so long for the Georgia delegation to join the Congress, or they would join and they would leave and things of that nature. I have a list to the Wikipedia page of the different delegates because you can find the delegates for all the different Congresses that took place before you get to the Articles of Confederation and then the Constitution. And that I hope that we actually do something for 250 years of the Constitution as well. But today we're talking about the Declaration of Independence. So I will show you the list of people who were a part of the Second Continental Congress in a second. But a lot of people were in and out. You have to think it wasn't like today where you could just jump on a plane and show up and, things were getting done. People were serving in the military. People were fighting in the Revolutionary War. They were doing a lot of other things that were happening at the time. People had family obligations. They got sick. If they got sick, they wanted to go home and be closer to their doctor. And this was several years that this went through. People were having babies, going back to different things when they were taking breaks, and a lot of them were also doing a lot of work in their home colonies or states. The thing that I think we forget a lot about, and I think I mentioned this during the last legal hour that I did when I was talking about how governments are formed and how governments look. The colonies had set up governments. Even if they were under the British Crown and the British Empire, they had very strong legislative bodies in their states. And, I tell my students all the time, like most people did not see themselves in the join or die, like this united federation that, Benjamin Franklin wanted it to be. They were a Virginian. They were a New Yorker. They were a Georgian. They were very much dedicated to their state governments. And the state governments were very powerful. The state governments, in most cases, made the delegates that ended up coming to these Congresses. And so a lot of them saw the work that they were doing in their states as more important in a lot of situations than they did in looking at, what are we going to do as far as this British issue and this federal government thing, right? So you have all of the different participants for my Georgia crew. You see the first person listed is Gwinnett, which is where Gwinnett County comes from. John Penn out of North Carolina, the Rutledge, Edward Rutledge from South Carolina. Massachusetts only had Mr. Hancock. Maybe that's why he made his signature so big on the document. We don't know. Massachusetts, we have Sam Adams and John Adams. We have our large Pennsylvania delegation because they were, meeting in Pennsylvania during that time. We have our large Virginia delegation. So we have these group of men who come from all over the Confederation of States, as they would come to be known, but all the different colonies. They finally make it in. They're meeting back and forth. And what I always do in my class on Congress is I set up each Congress and then I talk about the goals And then I talk about what the results were from the goals that they set at the time that they actually formed the Congress together. So the goals of the Second Continental Congress were, they had come to a decision after they had finished the First Continental Congress. The seeds had been planted. That Join or Die cartoon had been like 3 Congresses before that Benjamin Franklin had been talking about this. This is what we need to do. But they had come to the decision by the time they got to the Second Continental Congress in 1775 that it was time to govern ourselves. So the United Colonies of North America then becomes the United States of America. So they said, yes, we are still right now under the British rule, but we are going to unite in our different colonies first. And then we're going to go forward in regards to what we're going to do about becoming our own government and disassociating ourselves from the British Empire. So they have right now really a de facto government. They have their organized militias. They have the Continental Army. George Washington is obviously the star of that. And when you go to the place, the museum where they're all standing, I mean, George Washington towers over everybody. He's the large guy in the room. He's the rock star, the superstar. And you can see when you stand next to him versus standing next to some of the others, why people had a lot of respect for him. Because he just was a more of an imposing guy at the time, and also had obviously a lot of background in regards to what he was doing in the military. They had a Continental Army, and then in 1776 they created the Board of War and Ordnance. So when people talk about the Secretary of War, that comes in 1781, but they had a board. And that becomes really important again when I talk about the Articles of Confederation and all those different things. We have a unitary government. The legislature was it. The executive, this, president, a governor, all of those other things were seen as, something that could exist. They obviously liked George Washington in that role in the beginning. But that's when we get to the Constitution. After we do our Declaration of Independence and then we move into the Articles of Confederation, it's one body. It's the legislature. You have a president essentially of the legislature, but they're a member of the body chosen by the group, right? So the idea that we need to have this strong body, a unitary government, to be able to separate ourselves from the British Empire, I want people to keep in mind, because we have gone and strayed very far away from that. And I think that is going to be really important as we look to what the next 250 years look like, and if we can keep this republic. That, the famous phrase of Benjamin Franklin when he walks out and says, we have a republic if we can keep it, right? These are things that we have to know about the history in order to keep us going, because again, 250 years is not that long ago. So there was now a collection of the colonies, but remember, the colonies are still really strong. And many of the people who were in that room, many of the people on this list, especially those late coming Georgians, were coming from some really powerful states, some really powerful state legislatures that already, in some cases, had their own constitutions and were formalized. And so, their allegiance, even if it wasn't to the British crown, was to their states. They saw themselves in their states first. They were Virginians first. They were New Yorkers first. That's where they had their ties. And so it's important for us to remember that that's the group of people who were in the room. And they wanted to be able to organize as a federal or a group of colonies in order to continue to have France be on their side and to be able to negotiate, because that's the thing, when you're throwing the tea off the harbor, like it seemed like this like ragtag thing, but that followed, all these different acts, the Stamp Act and all these other things that were happening, where there was this idea, and it's in the Declaration, about taxation without representation. There had been multiple letters, there had been multiple communications from the other Continental Congress and from the other Congresses before then. They were always communicating back and forth with the British Empire. And really, the declaration becomes when they're like, we're doing all this writing. Think about it today. I've submitted all these FOIA requests. I've shown up at the meetings. I've made my comments. I've done all these other things, and nobody is responding to me. So, this Declaration of Independence is a response to continuing to petition and redress the government. Does that sound like something that ends up eventually in our First Amendment, that you have a right to be able to do that, right? That's where FOIA now even comes from, is the ability to be able to petition, redress, and get answers from your government. So the people in the colonies had been trying to do this, trying to address all of these issues, and had been getting turned down left and right, or ignored, or having additional taxes come that were going to be things that hurt them, right? So, they said, we're going to address this. And so that's where the Declaration of Independence comes from. And so when they come together in the Second Continental Congress, even a year before the Declaration of Independence, they are putting together the ability to be able to negotiate. But if negotiation doesn't work, we have another option to go, essentially. The actual results from the Congress. So prior to the Declaration of Independence, you have the Olive Branch Petition on July the 5th of 1775. So a little less than a year before we end up with the Declaration. This refers to the text. Like I said, these are the slides. I just copied them from what I use with my students. So we talk about Bunker Hill. We talk about a lot of the different battles and different things of that nature. I'm teaching a history course, African American history, this fall, and I'm working on this thing that I call the lenses, historical lenses. And so, when we look at things through different historical lenses and the way that we process information the best, for some people, that chronology is great. For me, geography really works well. Biography works well. For some, this idea of military and government is a good way for them to understand the chronology of what we go through. And a lot of that I actually use in the course comes from our military history. So I use military history in order to discuss a lot of these different things. So they send the Olive Branch Petition, and the king rejects it and says that the colonies are in revolt. There had been much discussion of this. The poor Bostonians had just been called the worst of the worst, because they were doing all these things that were making the British government mad, right? So he said, I read this, but we're not going to do anything that you have petitioned to talk about here. And I'm determining that you guys are in trouble, essentially by determining that you're in revolt. Like, we're acknowledging it. We're going to try to quiet you. So you think about that in a military sense, but you also have to think about it in a government sense, right? So what they're forming in the Continental Congress is the governmental response. You have a military response, but then you also have this de facto government response against a very large British imperial government. So then you have the Lee Resolution on July 2nd, and that's when the colony said that we are now independent states. So it's important to understand that comes first. And I can't remember right now off the top of my head which one of the founding fathers thought that the day that we would celebrate would be the July 2nd date. I can't remember who it was right now. Somebody will know and put it in the comments if they watch this. But, the idea was that resolution of saying we now as British colonies are separating from you and we are going to become independent states makes a whole lot of sense when you think about what I just said in regards to the idea that people saw themselves in their statehood first. Their states had constitution. Their states had established governments that already had existed for a long time, were very well established, and were regulating everything that was going on in their particular states. That becomes an issue later on because they're issuing their own money. So if you cross over the line, you might have different money and it may not be accepted. That's part of the reason why full faith and credit and other things come into play with the Constitution later on. But, that July 2nd is the date that the colonies say we are now our own independent governing states. The different people that came, those different representatives had already kind of had this discussion within their state legislatures, and the different delegates coming were saying, all right, we're ready to do this. This was important for states like Georgia who were late to the game, because now they're saying, all right, here I come. We as a state are fine with separating at this point. Then on July 4th is when you have the Declaration of Independence, and those now independent states from a few days ago are uniting themselves as the United States of America. And so it's important to understand why they did it that way. Not only because they had a lot of belief in states' rights and different things of that nature, but they had established governments in that way. So even if there were issues with them being a united confederation of states, they still were independent as far as their different statehoods, their state constitutions, things of that nature. So there was a good reason for them to do it that way, and it was a sharp and bright reason for them to do it that way, as far as the legal ability to be able to negotiate with other governments, and be able to go forward. And they're using models from across the world in this sense of having different areas, states, colonies, countries, to combine into one federal government, right? And they had a provisional government under Articles of Confederation later on by the end of this Continental Congress. Because remember, it went until 81, until 1781. And it was unicameral, that one house. We don't have three branches of government that we now have. So this is what they were all talking about and discussing in this room where it happened. And then we end up with the Declaration. And there's a couple of parts of this declaration that I want to point out in particular. One of the things that I always try to do on Martin Luther King Day is actually read several of his speeches to actually, hear the words, not just honor or celebrate, but actually listen to what is going on. And, I think that one of the things that I see happening now with Juneteenth celebrations, that is something that I used to do for 4th of July, was, hearing the words of those who had been formerly enslaved, or reading the newspaper articles about people looking for their families or different things of that nature. Actually reading the text. It's also part of this historical lens that I'm talking about. Using primary source documents is really important to have an understanding, and also having that background of understanding why people did things the way that they did them, I think is really important. And I think that's another thing too, that in my exploration of being a descendant of people who were formerly enslaved, and people who have been disenfranchised in this country throughout, it's still, when I look at the way that they set the government up, when I look at the documents, when I look at the foresight that they had in regards to making it something that could be workable and changed. It's even talked about here in this document about how we can create this government, but then we might need to change it in order to address the issues. I still think it's wild that people are working on this and drafting this and in the room doing this while there are other human beings who are not the all men who are created equal, right? Like I will never be able to take that out of my consideration of this. But I can't appreciate the founders of the United States for the way that they declared their independence and then put together a government. Even I still don't see the Articles of Confederation as a failure, because much of it then became part of the Constitution. It was a draft, is kind of the way that I see it. But, the things that they did really, and the system that they created really was amazing. And so when I look at this document and I actually sit through and read it, and I read through the whole thing today, and not just in preparation of this, but as something that, the last couple of years, after going there and seeing the document and doing all those other things I've been doing in order to just have an understanding of an appreciation of what that moment was. But one of the biggest things that I want to discuss is after the portion that we all kind of quote and know, that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator to certain unalienable rights, Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. Great. This next sentence is really, really important. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. So we have to, this is like the Lord of the Flies, if you had to read the Lord of the Flies when you were in school, right? In order to ensure that people have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, then that's why government exists. That's the whole reason that the government is here. It is to ensure that we have the rights to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. Rights and responsibilities. I always, the course that I created and taught for the Muskegon Exit program many years ago was rights and responsibilities, where I taught people incarcerated in the Muskegon County Jail, their rights under the Constitution. We did this, some of my slides that now I'm teaching to my college students are adapted from what I was teaching the people who are incarcerated, who are very interested in knowing like what their rights are once they come out on probation or parole, or even if they don't have either of those things, to not find themselves facing the criminal justice system again. You have rights. And so I talk about that, but then I also talk about the responsibilities that you have towards that government. So the reason that the government exists is to protect these things for us, but then we also have responsibilities in order to ensure that it exists and is intact in a way in order for us to be able to continue to have those rights. That's why it's important when you think about, the response to that prior petition and to many of the petitions that had gone to the British Crown of, no, you're revolting. You're revolting against the government. You're not just expressing your issues against the East Indian Company when you throw the tea over the harbor and you mess up this private company that has political ties. You're not just messing up their profits or whatever the case may be. Like, you are actually interfering with the government, and the government exists in order to protect your rights. But the rest of this declaration, and when you get down into essentially the complaints that the Federation, the signers, have against the king, against the monarch, is that he is not. You are now using this government in a way that is not doing anything to protect our rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. All right. So to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. We as men create these institutions to protect the things that are given to us by the Creator. Right? So when you think about a monarchy, where, it's, if you're the family member, you become the monarch, right? And not just that example, but they're thinking about Roman examples and Greek examples and all these other things, right? Where they're not necessarily saying that there are not things that come to us from a creator. They're acknowledging that, but they're saying then we as men, we as people, then create these governments in order to protect those rights. And the governments are deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So that's the next part, right? We as men create these institutions, but then the institutions can only operate, survive, and do what they need to do if the people consent to that. So they're acknowledging the fact that we will have a government to help protect our rights, but the government must listen to the people, because the government can't continue if it doesn't listen to the people. And this is really important when we think about our right to petition and redress the government, your ability to file those FOIA requests, all those things that are allowed of us now are because of the words that are in this document. The right to protest, the right to gather and say, we no longer consent to this, comes from this document. And so the idea that those of us who have an issue with the way that certain things in the government are happening, when you go to government and you say, we no longer consent to this, that is patriotism. So this idea of being patriotic has always been like a blind allegiance or just an allegiance to the system. They were not saying that. That has never been the definition of American patriotism. From the beginning, well before we even have this document and all these other Congresses that existed. But also in this document, the Declaration of Independence, it says, we as the people, if we do not agree, we do not consent to be governed in this way, we have the ability to come and say, no, the government is here to protect our rights. And if it is not doing that, protesting against the government, seeking change and redress, is enshrined from the very beginning of the United States of America. That is patriotism. And to be quite honest, the times when I have just gotten frustrated and just been like, I need a break. I can't do it anymore. You know, what you don't want is a system where nobody feels the need to say, hey, I don't consent to this. Hey, it's not working well. It's not protecting my life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. If people just acquiesce, or people just give up because they don't believe the government has the ability to protect their life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, if you just give up, then that's not patriotism. You no longer have a belief in the government that's supposed to be protecting you. And if you no longer then go and say, I don't consent to this, I want redress, we need to change this in order to protect the rights of people, these unalienable rights by their creator. If people just stop doing that and nobody was protesting the government, there would be no need for the government. So when people have issues with the way the government is funding and they address it, they are being patriotic. I think this is really important for us to think about right now, because right now what we have a lot of is, especially with social media, is people taking that I do not consent or that ability to redress or address the government, and it looks a whole lot different. Yes, there are still times when people show up to the courthouse steps, show up to the steps of the legislature, testify during hearings and submit comments when bills are coming to be passed. But our Congress, our federal Congress, and even some of our state Congresses here in Michigan, we've had the same issue. They're not passing a lot of laws. There's a lot of committees that have a lot of hearings and you can give comment. I do want to shout out the Senate bill that just came out and will likely be my topic at the end of the month. We'll see. Which is incorporating juvenile or youth defense into the Michigan Indigent Defense Commission. So there will be much more protections for our young people who are going into the juvenile justice system. And so I shout out to that. That got passed. I don't think Governor Whitmer has signed it yet, but hopefully she will sign it soon. But shout out to everybody who is in the children's law section and SADO and different groups who have pushed for these protections for young people. So that will probably be my topic as long as the governor signs it. And we'll talk a little bit about that at the end of July. But, doing it that way is still what happens, and it's still an important way, in a way that we need to learn and understand. But now with the advent of social media, we also see a lot more people who are saying I do not consent or addressing the government in other ways. And, I think that we have to remember that not only do people have a First Amendment protection and freedom, they are also using platforms that are owned by other people and corporations in order to do that. But it is not different than all the newspapers that used to exist, right? Several of the men on that list that I showed you, Benjamin Franklin obviously being one of the most famous ones, had newspapers where they were very clear in regards to the fact that they were reporting on different things, but they had an opinion. They had a slant, they had a view. And so when you have, I've seen them all over now because I follow a lot of different things on social media. I'm still connected to a lot of stuff in Georgia and whatever the case may be, where it's like the taxpayers group on Facebook and, somebody posting as like the citizens of such and such. And, all of these local government things that are happening and how they tie into other stuff. And, um, I'll say this, not always properly informed, but you don't have to always be properly informed in order to say you don't consent. I hope you then search to become properly informed. But we see a lot of that now, and I think people are acting like it's never happened before. That's not true. It's really always been like this. You might not have had a subscription to all those papers, or you might not have been in all the meetings, but now that we have social media, you have access to what was going on in the other meeting or the other paper that you didn't subscribe to before. The thing now is once we join these platforms, we've subscribed. It might not be in your algorithm, but then you might find it. So like the thing the last couple of days is the white supremacy group on Facebook, and Black people found it and then infiltrated this public group, right? Well, now that we're all on the same platform, once you subscribe, like and subscribe, on all the YouTube things, then it ends up in your algorithm. And so you may see things that you didn't see before, but that doesn't mean that it didn't exist before. And this is what the people in that room were dealing with as well. We're going to create this government to protect our rights, but if it doesn't work, the power of the government, the ability for the government to function, has to come from the consent of the governed. That is huge, and I don't think we talk about that enough. There's obviously other things on this page, but I am already like super far into this. I'm 42 minutes in, and I'm not going to make it more than an hour because it's called a legal hour for a reason. In my mind, I was going to do this in 30 minutes, but I'm a lawyer and I like to talk too much. And I got really wound up when I started talking about certain things. So we have our list of, essentially the complaints against the monarch. And there's a lot of things that they're saying that the monarch has done. And a few of these are really important because there's some things that we see even happening today. He has called together legislative bodies at unusual, uncomfortable, and distant from the depository of their public records for the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures. One of the complaints from Georgia was, why do you guys keep meeting up there? Like, why don't you come down here at some point? Because, we have to travel a long way to get to you. Part of the Articles of Confederation and also in the Constitution that comes is this protection for the representatives that are sent from the different states for when they have to travel to get to where they get to. Right? So that was a big issue. You're going to send somebody over from the empire to come meet with people, and they don't get the communication until it's like, they're going to be in New York in a week. Well, we're in Georgia. We can't get there. We're in South Carolina. We're not going to get there in a week. And it's the middle of winter. Like, we're not doing that. And he would do that purposefully in order to make it an issue for them to be able to come and respond. These are still things that become issues, not to the point of revolt, but I even think about our local county, the county where I live, has their meetings on Thursdays at 10:45. I don't know if they're doing it this year. I don't know if they've done it in a while, but they used to in the summertime have some 6:00 meetings at different places around the county. The Michigan Supreme Court, a couple of years ago, I was able to take my students to an oral argument because they came and they did the oral argument on the campus of of Southwest Michigan College in Dowagiac, Michigan. And they go up to the UP and they do oral arguments there so that people have access to the government. A lot of people are never going to see an oral argument in Lansing, because they can't get to Lansing. But when they tour and they go around other places, it's an ability for the governed to be able to access and see their government in action. It might be, it's easier to get to DC, but it's not super easy for everybody to be able to get there. But now that we are able to, even though the Supreme Court still doesn't have video and the courts still don't have video, that's a whole nother discussion, another future topic for the legal hour. Now when the recent decisions from the last week came out, they play the audio so that people can have access to it. You have some committee meetings that are closed, but then they come, some that are in open session so that people can hear and see their government in action, so that you can give public comment. Open meetings is a big thing. I see all kinds of open meeting complaints and discussion, and people making sure that they're doing open meetings right in our local bodies, and that goes all the way up to the federal government. So this idea of the legislature or the government then opening up and making sure that things are convenient for people to be able to access is actually enshrined as an issue of which they want to protect. It's part of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in the Declaration of Independence. He has endeavored to prevent the population of these states, for that purpose obstructing the laws of the naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migrations hither, and raising the conditions of new appropriations of land. I will do a whole nother legal hour on this topic. But part of the Declaration of Independence is a concern from the governed that he is restricting the ability for people to become a part of these now United States. It was never about restriction. I'm just going to leave that at that because then I'll get on a whole nother topic. He has made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their offices and the amount and payment of their salaries. This goes right back to the Senate bill that I was just talking about for youth defense. Part of the problems that we found in not only youth defense, but in adult defense and in some of the other ways in the state of Michigan that courtrooms and different things were being run is that attorneys were being appointed by judges and they were not having to report to anybody else. If those judges then don't have independence on the bench, we all take an oath. That's the other thing that I thought about when I was in Boston and in Philadelphia. And as I've, talked about and thought about not only this 250 years, but just, my connection to patriotism and being an American. I have taken an oath multiple times. I've become a lawyer in 2 different states. I've become a prosecutor where I have to take an oath to uphold the Constitution. And in Georgia, that I was not a communist was part of my oath as prosecutor. I always found that interesting. I've taken multiple oaths, written and oral oaths throughout the years. And, those words are not just words. They mean something, right? And I'm supposed to uphold and defend the Constitution. Pretty much every single one that I've taken tied into any type of legal work that I do is connected to upholding the Constitution of the state of Michigan, the state of Georgia, the federal Constitution. And so that does not mean then that I have to do something to make a judge happy. In fact, a lot of times I end up doing things that don't make the judges happy. But I have to do what I need to do to uphold the Constitution and to represent my client who, regardless of the situation in which they are in, still has an ability to seek life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So once we create these documents, and then we are governed by these documents with the consent of the governed, and those governed include people who may have made mistakes and different decisions, they are still part of the governed, who have to consent to being governed by the government who is supposed to protect our rights. I'm not beholden to the person making the ruling. I'm not beholden to the governor or the president or the superintendent of schools or the head of the commission or the mayor or whoever the case may be, the township supervisor. The documents are that's why the documents are in all these little cases and we take such great care of them. And the documents are the words, it's not the people, it's the system. Our allegiance is to be to the system for which we have consent to be governed, not any individual. I'm getting close, guys. I got 10 minutes left. I want to point out a few other things. Obviously, I talked a little bit about imposing taxes on us without our consent, depriving us in many cases of the benefits of a trial by jury. All of these different things that are going to start becoming part of the Articles of Confederation, but then our first 10 amendments, our Bill of Rights. It's not new. They were workshopping and discussing these. And then, one of the biggest things too that I want you guys to read are the Federalist Papers, the arguments that then come after the Declaration of Independence as they seek to form the government. I also recently, because one of my students was using this and had a topic on it, started reading more of the Anti-Federalist Papers. And I think that's really important too. I think that's an important part of what we should be looking at, and a full understanding and breadth of our government, how our government was created to work, and how, if we think that that's a good way, as we consent to the governed to continue to be governed, if that's the way that it should work. For taking away our charters, abolishing our most valuable laws, and altering fundamentally the forms of our governments. So this goes back to that July 2nd when we said first we're independent states and then we are the United States. They were passing laws. They were, creating forms and systems that worked best for them in the places where they were, because that was the idea of the consent to be governed. And that's going to look different in Massachusetts than it's going to look in South Carolina. Right? So, when we think about states' rights, it's not just like for slavery. That was one big part of it. But what I had to start doing is expanding the understanding of the economics, and I think that also ties into to those who are enslaved. But it also there's issues of misogyny that we have to look at. It's not perfect, and it's never going to be perfect, guys. Your idea of what would be a perfect federal government, perfect state government, perfect local government is not going to be what I think is perfect. The consent to be governed does not include perfection. It does not require perfection, because perfection is going to be different for everyone else. But we have to have in mind, especially those who represent us, those who we vote for to represent us, have to understand that we have to be able to address and redress them. Because if it is working for the group of people which they talk and they think it's working, we have the ability to say, you may think it's working, but it's not. And here's the long-term consequences of you thinking that it should operate this way. Again, that is patriotism. If people stopped and just said, I don't care anymore, if they say, I'm just going to acquiesce to it, then we're done. I was watching the This Land series, which I think is a really well done series. And I was watching the episode on Alaska, and it talked about there was a descendant there whose grandmother was 8 years old when Alaska became part of the United States. And not when it became a state, but when it as a region was purchased by the United States. And, they had been Russian citizens before then. And the descendant says that his grandmother used to talk about standing on a hill and seeing the Russian flag come down and seeing the American flag come up. And in that child's mind, like that was just like, okay, we were Russian and now we're American, or like whatever that means, right? One of the things I did not include on here that I should have included my picture of, and my other trip a couple of years later that was really meaningful to me, was going to New York and going to the Statue of Liberty. Obviously, I may have family in some parts that came that way, but I don't know about it. So I never really fully connected it before. It wasn't something that I thought about a whole lot. But as you're on that ferry and you're headed out there and you see this statue, and then you go into the room and you see, the different lines, and you can imagine and picture people being in those lines and being checked by medical folks and doing all those other things. You can't help when you're in the place. And maybe this is just me. Like, it's been a big connection for me to actually go to these places, but to actually be in that place and see it, and to understand, like, for that girl, it was just seeing the flags change. For people showing up on Ellis Island, it was, welcome to America. Now you're free to be here, right? But it's much more than that. The documentary then says in Alaska, like, the people who chose to stay chose to stay. They were given opportunities to leave, and they decided to stay. They had built roots there. Their happiness and that life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness was in that place. And so their allegiance changed as far as the government who was representing them. But the idea that they might not have thought about, it, that 8-year-old girl didn't think about, is that she then has now become the governed. But her desires to be governed are still important, even as a young person. Even as a young person who arrives at Ellis Island, who didn't, necessarily want to make the trip. Somebody else made the decision to make that trip for them. For those who were enslaved or born into slavery, when they become citizens, when we celebrate Juneteenth and their freedom and the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, once you become part of the governed, then you have to consent. It doesn't matter if you're a minority in any form or fashion. The purpose of this government is still to help ensure your rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so when you ask the government to give you those rights, or to give those rights to others where you see that it is not working for them and they no longer consent, especially if they're not able to say that they consent or don't consent, that is patriotism. And reading this document, I can celebrate this document, because even though it wasn't meant for me or my ancestors at the time that it was created, it applies to me now. And I am the governed, and I have to consent to be governed. And if there's issues that I have in any form or fashion with the government that is that I swore an oath to defend and to represent and to understand and to not challenge in the legal realm in my job, that doesn't mean that I can't disagree with what a judge thinks. In fact, this is telling me that that's what I need to do. That is our role in this government as the governed. We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America, in General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do, in the name and by the authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of the right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states, they have the full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, that goes back to one of their goals, and establish, my face is in the way, And now I've made my face bigger. I definitely don't want to do that. Sorry, guys. I'm at the end of my recording and now I don't know what I'm doing. There we go. Do all other acts and things which independent states might of right do. That's huge. We are dissolving our relationship with you. You know, now there's been a lot of things. We're going to annex this portion of the city. We're going to do these different things. That has happened in different places, right? But that idea of saying our allegiance is dissolved. And now we as a group are coming together and we have just as much power as you do to be able to negotiate and to be able to levy taxes and do all the different things to be able to run a government for the people, by the people. It's our time. That is powerful and that deserves to be celebrated. But in celebrating it, we have to talk about how we are now governing and operating and what things may need to change. So again, up there on that second floor of that room, they started to come together and figure out how that was going to look. You know, they came together in this room. They continued to meet in this room for a couple of years and work out our different documents. And again, I hope that we celebrate 250 years. I hope we celebrate the Articles of Confederation at some point and just don't say it's a failure. But then also in a couple of years that we celebrate the Constitution of the United States and the Bill of Rights in the same way. And acknowledge the fact that we as the governed have the ability, it is given and enshrined in us from this document, from the Declaration of Independence, in order to be able to have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And we all deserve to have that. All right, I'm at 100. I'm at an hour and 2 minutes. So I am going to end the legal hour for today. As I stated in my post, I will have some kind of special editions potentially again this month. But then I will be back on the 4th or the last Sunday of the month in order to give you our regularly scheduled edition of the legal hour. Thank you and have a happy 4th of July. That's the first time I have probably ever said that. But after today's discussion and the work that I have been doing over the years, I don't have any issue saying that. So happy 4th of July and happy 2 weeks from Juneteenth as well. And continue to do everything that you need to do in order to make sure that you as the governed are consenting to the way that the government is working for you towards your ability to have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Have a great day.